Thanks, Amber. Welcome. This is part of the Resource Center's summer webinar series on issues around the intersection of child protection and domestic violence. Today we're highlighting work in a few states to increase collaboration between child welfare and domestic violence agencies. Our presenters today are Lana Davis from Futures Without Violence. She's the Director of Children and Youth Programs. Joe Simonson from an Ohio Domestic Violence Network, Family Systems Advocacy Director. Carol Lanza, Domestic Violence Liaison to the Department of Child Protection and Permanency, and also a therapist for children exposed to trauma. And Devin Rojas, Providence House Domestic Violence Services, Domestic Violence Liaison. Thank you very much to our presenters, and Lana, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda, and hi everybody. I want to thank the National Council for inviting us, and I'm honored to be working with colleagues from Ohio and New Jersey. Today, I'm just going to talk for a little bit and give a little bit of a history lesson about how we got here, and try to set up the conversation a little bit, and then we're going to hear from Joe and Kara and Devin about their work, both statewide and on the ground, and then we're going to facilitate a little bit of a conversation. So I want to start with the history lesson of how we all got here and the person who really started this work, and that was Susan Schechter. Hopefully many of you know her or have read some of her work, but it was really her work in the late 1980s that started pushing to have advocates, domestic violence advocates, working together with child welfare folks. And the reason she thought that was important was that she had a hypothesis that if we provided advocacy services for women in the child welfare system, that we could improve the children's safety and the mother's safety, and we could prevent kids from becoming unnecessarily involved in the child welfare system. And so she tried out that hypothesis at Children's Hospital by hiring advocates to work in the hospital, training the clinicians and doctors to be able to identify domestic violence, and then bringing in the advocates. That early research that she did proved that about 43% of the cases that they worked on, this was Project Awake at Children's Hospital, did not end up with children in the foster care system. So Susan took those lessons to the then commissioner of the Massachusetts Child Welfare System and asked if they would be willing to try an experiment. And so the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families was the first statewide program to start bringing in advocates to work alongside child welfare workers. So today, what do we know? We've learned a lot since the late 80s, right? We've learned quite a bit about how children who are exposed to domestic violence are often exposed to other types of violence. We know that almost half of the children who are exposed to violence are exposed to other kinds of violence. In terms of our knowledge around how often domestic violence is actually happening in the child welfare system, that's pretty sketchy data still. Jeff Edelson, a very long time ago, did a review of the literature and found somewhere between 30 and 60% of the cases. If you look at the state data that comes in, not all states are reporting, and many states don't have the mechanisms to really be able to count. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of our states and counties figuring out what the prevalence really is. We know that African American children, Native children, Latino children are overrepresented in the child welfare system. And we also know that many kids who are exposed to violence are also, parents are also facing other problems such as mental health and substance abuse. So I wanted to just take a second and talk a little bit about some core values or key principles or something that have stayed with me over the years and actually have evolved, quite frankly. But the first is really the care and concern for adult and child victims. And we all talk about this, that the needs of children and their parents, particularly the victims of domestic violence, are inextricably linked. And that's true, and it's an important value, and one that's really hard to sort of play out in practice. Two is around accountability, but also support for behavioral change. Three is a real care for the workforce, knowing that a parallel process is important, that we need to be treating our workforces on both sides with the same care that we expect them to give to the families that they're accountable to. And the fourth is that the notion of it takes a village, which couldn't be more true in this kind of work, where even if the domestic violence providers and the child welfare agencies did everything perfectly, it wouldn't work because it needs more than that. So within those four values, there's also the other driving political forces that we need to take really seriously, like racial and gender justice. And I'm going to give a brief example just in the spirit of humility. When I first started doing domestic violence work in Massachusetts in 1990, which was a very long time ago, I really felt like the only two values that existed was safety and accountability. So I thought that if we kept mothers safe and together and we got more men arrested, then that would be success. And, you know, today, just thinking about the world that we're living in right now, it feels terrible, right, to even say that I thought that was the answer. And so now I think it's really on us to, because of all we know, to really be able to examine how institutional racism and institutional sexism plays out in all our systems. And at the same time, we need really careful analysis of our own implicit biases, and we need people to check us on those. So at my position at Futures, I have the privilege and honor to be able to visit folks all around the country and hear about what they're doing and try to make connections and you know, build a network, if you will. And so what we've seen over the years is that most collaborative models fall into these three buckets. One is policy, one is practice, and the other is resource development. And for those folks who are out there that are interested in strengthening what you're already doing or getting ready to try something new, these three dimensions really all need to be in place. So for example, and there was plenty of examples of policy and practice and resource development. I just chose a few to make a point. But understanding that the policies that we have within the child welfare system around who comes in the front door and how domestic violence comes in the front door, and really working collaboratively with people in your community, with domestic violence folks and others, to make sure that the policy that you develop is one that shares the values of the program. Another example of collaborative policymaking is working together to understand and do analysis around fatality reviews. Those kinds of things where people are working together either at the state level or at the county level can really begin to blend the expertise that we all have. Under practice, we're going to talk about co-location, do a deep dive into that, but there's other practice models like conferencing, and there's many different models of conferencing, how we can really work together to strengthen our practice. And then third is resource development. And what we've seen over the years is that communities that are less resourced, in particular, don't have programs for people who use violence, any kind of intervention programs, really struggle with this. How do we offer behavioral change and accountability if we don't invest in those kinds of programs for folks? The same for kids who experience violence and are exposed to it, and trauma services, and the same for women who are substance using and need safe and confidential help. So I'm going to jump quickly to co-location, and we at Futures, 15 years after the Green Book, which I know is part of this webinar series, we did a survey to all the states to figure out who was doing some kind of collaborative model around co-location. And we got about 23 of the states, about half of the states reporting. It was 60% of those states saying they were doing something. So, and that's only like 13. So we know that a lot of states, and I know that a lot of you on the phone have been doing this work. We don't know how many folks have been able to sustain it and for how long. And so we know that programs have started and stopped. But I think that what we need to be able to do is really figure out what the impact is of co-location, how it really affects the outcomes for children and for their families, so we can put some investing into this practice so it can be standardized. So the last thing I'm going to say before I turn it over to my colleague is that these are just some questions that I think about when I talk to folks. So the header probably should be, why are we doing this? And so these are some thoughts and things that people are doing. And one of the things that's important about doing any kind of co-location is to understand why you're doing it and what the goals are. So are we doing it for systems change and policy reform? Are we doing it to increase the knowledge of the workforce? Are we doing it to have advocacy for survivors and their children, like Susan intended? Are we doing it to link to confidential community services? Are we doing it as partners, or are we doing it as consultants? Do we work with all members of the family or just victims? And lastly, are we doing it to improve outcomes for children and families? So we're going to come back to some of these questions, and you're going to hear from Kara and Devin and Joe about why they're doing it, and then we can talk more about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
So hello, folks. It's nice to have so many of you on the call. This is a great topic and something that I really enjoy thinking about with people like Lana and our other colleagues around the nation and here in Ohio. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about our experience of collaboration in Ohio with some emphasis on co-located advocacy and joint service models, which is another phrase that's sometimes used for these types of projects and partnerships, and then a little bit even beyond those models as well. So I do work at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, and I'm what we call the Family Systems Advocacy Director. So I'm really focused on supporting families and supporting professionals that are working with what we're starting to call system-involved families. So that could be people that are involved in the child protective services system or child welfare system, perhaps families that are involved with the adult protective service system. So that's sort of the focus of my area of work. So in Ohio, our history kind of goes back to, I actually began in 1992, and I specifically recall in my first position in a domestic violence program looking at some newsletters and materials of some really interesting work coming out of Massachusetts, which I know now is Lana's work and Susan Schechter's work as well. She was very important in my development as a communications director and an advocate in the local program. So in Ohio, we had a program in Dayton, which is Montgomery County, if you're familiar with Ohio, and they received some federal demonstration dollars early back in the Green Book era, and actually began some collaborative partnership between their two different domestic violence programs. One was a shelter and one was a non-resident program, and their children's services. And I believe it even involved some mental health partners and health itself. I think some of the funding came from our Ohio Department of Health. But they were able to establish a co-located program. It's had up to 3 advocates at some point. It's currently at 1 co-located advocate in this particular Children's Services office, and she's a great resource. I'm happy to connect you to. She's been doing this position since it started about 25 years ago, something like that, I think she told me. So we had that happening. They developed sort of the protocol between the agencies, how referrals would come in, what kind of services would be offered through their co-located program, which does what many of them do, kind of looking at providing consultation to caseworkers, support and maybe making some screening decisions where there are questions of domestic violence or suggestions of that, and then actual work with the victims' families, looking at safety planning and assisting in CPO processes. She leads a domestic violence education group and other things. One thing that Shelby encouraged me to, Shelby, who's the advocate in that position and has been for a long time, is that just really the receptivity of the caseworkers at her Children's Services office. They are very grateful and make great use of her, happy to have somebody on site. We also sort of experienced the big prevention boom with CDC-funded Delta projects and such in Ohio that really pushed us and kept us sort of in conversations with a lot of important stakeholders in our state. In 2010, there was an expansion, or a pilot, I should say, of differential response in Ohio's child welfare system. And so that's how sort of the project that I'm going to speak to a great deal in coming slides came about for us. It was actually a child welfare project on differential response, looking at traditional pathways and providing protective services or alternatives, maybe a little friendlier. Sometimes they lovingly refer to it as Children's Services Light here in our state, but a different approach to families that was less investigative and confrontational and more supportive. In that, they found out they just didn't quite know what to do with our domestic violence cases. Which kind of pathway does that go into? What kind of response should these families have? If we're doing family engagement strategies that involve the whole family, what do we do when one of those family members is a battering partner? So because of those questions, there was sort of an offshoot project, which I'm going to refer to as the Ohio IPV Collaborative. And many state stakeholders came together and started to grapple with this question and what the state wanted to provide to the child welfare workers in terms of direction and training and so forth. We are pleased and feel that a lot of our success actually does come from kind of establishing this as a public-private partnership. Again, I'm going to share with you some of the partners on the next slide, so I'll finish that conversation there. And similar to Lana's reference to parallel processes, we really thought it was important that sort of our expectations for what local people could do or should do really needs to be modeled at the state level too. And so trying to hold ourselves as state coalition and other state partners sort of accountable in the same way that we were hoping that local groups would function. Within each of our eras from the Green Book back in the 90s, in the early 90s when the program was being set up in Montgomery County, to our current collaborative processes, we've established quite a range of challenges. Most of them are to be expected with this kind of work, and this is not an easy problem to address, and it's not it's not simple when there's a lot of varying systems, players, needs, competing priorities, different funding sources. And so we've experienced most of those, and I think have successfully navigated most of those, but we're still always constantly trying to monitor and manage those challenges across groups. So this next slide just shows you an example of, on our state level, who participated in this Ohio IPV collaborative. It was our Supreme Court. It was FILAW is actually the group that's sort of our hub at the center that kind of is coordinating all of the contracts and the service providers and partners and bringing us together when we need to be brought together. We've got some funders, which are the Health Path Foundation of Ohio and Ohio Children's Trust Fund. The Ohio Department of Job and Family Services administers or supervises, I should say, our child welfare agencies in Ohio. David Mandel and Associates brings to us the Safe and Together curriculum for training our caseworkers and supervisors in the child welfare field, and then also invites other community partners to those. And then Ohio Domestic Violence Network is the State Domestic Violence Coalition, and we really serve as a technical assistance arm to the local projects and then also back to our state partners when they want specific information about domestic violence that we can provide. So this actually was a bulleted list. It doesn't look so bulleted here, but we'll just keep moving along. At our state level, what the collaboration really looks like is, again, that training that we're providing through David Mandel and Associates model, the Safe and Together model. It's very consistent with the principles of Susan Schechter's work and the Green Book projects early on. The training is to CPS, but at times there are training days that include community partners and advocates. My role in the project is actually providing technical assistance, and I really, not to toot my own horn, but anybody that was setting up a project like this, I think it's really wise to think about what kind of technical assistance needs to be in place as well. It's really important to have a strong and qualified arm trying to help as projects make their way. Collaboration is difficult in itself, and domestic violence and CPS are both really complex fields. In our project, the state level partners came together and developed a model protocol. It's called The Impact of Batterers on Kids, and I can make that available. It's available probably if you Google those words, you would find it online. But it is a multidisciplinary protocol really looking at this intersection of domestic violence and child maltreatment and how we hope systems could operate and collaborate. It's for use for local communities to look to and draw down to their community and start applying locally. Other things that we do through this project is that we're really coordinating things like, just presentations at conferences, whether it's our Attorney General's conference or our Public Children Services Association conference. We've got child advocacy conferences, lots of things. And so by bringing our partnership together, we can kind of coordinate our approach to moving our message. And then we have partner meetings and quarterly partner meetings and quarterly meetings of the trainers that are actually delivering the training out in the field. So on the local level, some of the things that we're really helping try to support in terms of local community collaboration is this idea of co-located PD advocates or consultant programs. We have one in Hamilton County, which is Cincinnati, that has just really taken off. They started with 2 co-located advocates, went to 4, and now they're, I believe they're at 6, or at least they're trying to hire to have 6 advocates on their team right now. They're doing great work, and they were actually assisted greatly by our veteran co-located advocate in the Dayton area. And I'll just share some statistics with you real quickly. I have from them from last year. They served 424 families, and that included 1,823 individuals. They made 400 service referrals, including to shelters and other domestic violence programs and to batterers intervention programs. 145 of those referrals were to BIPs. And 71% of the families that came through their program received domestic violence safety plans, and 77% of those coming through the program had a comprehensive assessment done with advocates to help them determining, whether they're going to be looking at protection orders, if they want, if they need shelter services, or again the safety planning, doing lethality assessments, all that kind of good work. In addition, they consult with caseworkers, do case conferencing, they do training of the caseworkers, and so forth. Some of the other things we're trying to do in Ohio are really encourage the invitation, whether they're co-located advocates or not, to really encourage the inclusion of advocates in some of the child welfare processes, like family group decision-making and semi-annual reviews. We're looking at really supporting child welfare workers and helping us in the support of non-offending parents. So we've got caseworkers that are really using solid models and have a great understanding of domestic violence from their training and new practice models, and are showing up in domestic relations courts, assisting in hearings for protection orders and so forth. We have projects around Ohio that are really looking to work together to try to bring in services that are needed. For instance, many of our communities really want to revisit the idea of batterers intervention programs, and they're finding that when they sort of approach judges or courts or funders or others, mental health agencies who might be in a good position to do these types of programs, when they sort of come at them from a couple of different angles with the same ask, that's been effective. We've got one program in Hancock County, Ohio, that actually the supervised visitation for children's services is operated by our domestic violence shelter. And so that project really has a strong understanding of domestic violence, batterers, victims, traumatized children, those things. And so they're really hyper-vigilant, I would say, in their monitoring of supervised visitation. Some folks are doing specialized parenting classes that are DV-informed, or looking at some of the divorcing parent programs that are required by some courts for families that are divorcing, and making sure that those are better informed around domestic violence and safety for the parties. So we've got all kinds of collaborative work going on there. Also, programs are asking for and trying to figure out what trauma-informed services for the children and family members look like, and how to make sure that those are installed in their community. So they're collaborating in those ways. Our groups are also doing a fair deal of cross-training. Sometimes foster parents are, the foster parent training, is being delivered or supported or provided in partnership with domestic violence programs. And we have, of course, Child Protective Services training our domestic violence programs on these new models that they're using, and also on sort of their time frames, what differential response means in terms of pathway assignments, and how that local community is making those choices around domestic violence cases. And then we're also looking at CPS training domestic violence programs on sort of their mandatory reporting requirements. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in this next slide. So in addition to those items I just mentioned around local community collaboration, I think one of the things when we were talking about why do we do this work, one of the good reasons to do it, in addition to all of the others that the questions that Lana had on one of her early slides, was also just the leveraging of resources. Sometimes it costs a little bit less to have people located right on site, and it costs less for the people that want to participate in our programs in terms of transportation and bus fare and making arrangements for child care and all of those things. So we're hoping also that there is some cost effectiveness in here. Collaboration also helps support, some of our communities are beginning to identify ways that, our domestic violence programs were seriously underfunded in Ohio for some time, and there were opportunities to get training that's relevant to domestic violence advocates that may have been sponsored or bringing in good speakers from the Child Protective Service field. And so invitations for them to attend CPS agency-sponsored trainings has been helpful. They've also worked on some collaborative funding proposals, things that they would like to see installed in their community where they've partnered around those sorts of grants. One of the things we did in a recent workshop that was on domestic violence and Child Protective Services collaborations, the group was beginning to look at sort of all of the active bodies that were in their community. For instance, in the Dayton community, they have 3 different batterers intervention programs operating for different groups. Like one is out of probation, adult probation. And those folks from those different BIP programs meet regularly. And so they just decided, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to invite our Child Protective Services workers to come in and present to us, and we could present back to them. So as they went through sort of all of the different groups that meet in their community around child abuse or domestic violence, they found a lot of gaps where perhaps a domestic violence advocate wasn't at the table, or a Child Protective Services worker should have been at the table in key groups. And so they were really able to plug those rather quickly when they just took inventory of that. We have a couple of really good examples of local protocols that have been developed. Again, Hamilton County and Montgomery County have child welfare specific internal protocols related to domestic violence. I have a lot more information on that if you're interested in what those look like, and I have permission to share those. Those protocols go from day-to-day case practice, referrals, local community resources, screening decisions, and those sorts of things. And then one thing that I think that sometimes gets overlooked, but there's a lot of data out there. A lot of data, particularly in, I think, Child Protective Services fields, they're collecting. Now, sometimes there's a cost to capturing what we want to capture, but in many ways, we found places where folks are willing to share information, and it's really helpful in making decisions about which direction to go. I'm going to share a slide on some data that was collected and that our technical assistants actually helped provide. But before I move on to that, I'll just say in Ohio, our Ohio Department of Job and Family Services has shared with our project that they are looking at about a 46% actuarial relationship of domestic violence in their screened-in cases in Ohio. So here's an example of some of the data I helped gather for one community. We gather all kinds of things, and we help them, we encourage them, we point them in different directions. But one thing that we've done, for instance, in one community, and I've changed the names here of the communities, I said, let's take a look at your law enforcement data. And so we were finding in this one county across these different law enforcement jurisdictions, there was a wide range of domestic violence arrest rates. And we're a preferred arrest state, so you pretty much are going to be arresting somebody when you get called to a domestic violence incident, unless you want to file some additional paperwork that says why it really didn't rise to the occasion. So for instance, this community of Landon PD, they had a 90% domestic violence arrest rate, which on the surface might be kind of encouraging, and 5% there were no charges. Now, of course, we can drill deeper and find out who's getting arrested, and there's a lot more content there that's complex and interesting. But if you just look down to maybe like Silver Lake, we were seeing on their calls only 20% arrest rate, and 70% of people had no charges. So what we were kind of noticed about this particular county was Landon PD was serving the community of color, very much higher demographic rates of people of color. And Silver Lake was a really sort of well-to-do, wealthy, gated community. So that gave us some pause. And the reason, not necessarily to talk just about the law enforcement responses, but how those responses impacted the children's services work, because they were making decisions whether a family got screened in for services or screened out for services based solely on was somebody arrested? Or they might be making a decision, wow, that's really got to go the traditional response pathway and not the alternative response pathway because there was an arrest in this case. And so it really encouraged them to start thinking more deeply about changes in practice around screening, around sort of their assessment of whether someone was safe or not, should maybe not solely be based on whether someone was arrested or not. Somebody could be in great danger and be in one of these communities that's making less arrests. So it helped with them thinking about sort of also maybe what they want to do in their community around collaborative approaches to disparities of children of color in the child welfare system, in the law enforcement responses, in the pursuit of, prosecutions, and really took them in a different direction in their task force initiatives and even in their training initiatives. So this is one of the sort of things that has come about through some of the collaboration and data sharing. I only have a few minutes, like one maybe, left for me to present a little bit more on our work here in Ohio, and I will pick up with some questions at the end. But I just wanted to share that there are sort of some expectations out there in our statutes around collaboration. So if you look to CAPTA and the funds that come through some of the sources, and I think maybe Lana may have better information on this, but there are expectations in those statutes around collaboration specific to domestic violence and collaborating with domestic violence programs, domestic violence advocates, domestic violence coalitions. There's also collaborations in our funding awards. For instance, we have those in Ohio regarding our marriage license fees or other sources of funding. There's collaboration expectations that can be placed into these internal protocols, like I mentioned, out of Hamilton County and Montgomery County. There are real collaborations, like you will attend these task forces, or you should attend, or we want co-training, we want cross-training. And then I think we can articulate collaboration expectations in our trainings, our skills, and our hiring practices. And so if you'd like more information on that, I'm happy to be a resource person to you about those. And I'm going to sum up and listen to the rest of the presentation, and will be available for questions or follow-up.
Hi, this is Cara Lanza with Devin Rojas, and we are the Domestic Violence Liaison with Providence House of Ocean County, and we are co-located in our local domestic Department of Child Protection and Permanency offices. So on this slide, I just really want to kind of go over the Domestic Violence Liaison project, just give over a brief history. The Domestic Violence Liaison Project is a collaboration between the New Jersey Department of Child Protection and Permanency and the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence at the state level and local Department of Child Protection and Permanency offices and local domestic violence programs at the county level. The program started in 2008, increased to all counties in 2010. A few counties have one domestic violence liaison that splits time between multiple offices, but at this time there are 31 domestic violence liaisons statewide. The county's local domestic violence agency employs the domestic violence liaison. The domestic violence liaison is embedded in the local offices as a consultant and advocate. The goal of the Violence Liaison Project is to increase safety, stability, and well-being, and to improve outcomes for children and their families in domestic violence situations. In addition, the goal is to strengthen the Department of Children and Families and Department of Child Protection and Permanency's capacity to effectively assess and intervene with families and domestic violence. So on the next slide, we're going to kind of the role of the domestic violence liaison and what we're doing in these local offices. So case consultations and conferences, this is really where the meat of the education by the domestic violence liaison happens. There is such complexity with the cases, besides domestic violence, there's substance abuse, trauma, and or mental health. Therefore, when having a consult with a caseworker, It gives the caseworker a safe space to discuss things, any judgments, and possible biases about the case. The worker is also able to express their perspective of the case, which provides the opportunity to collaborate together to kind of develop a shared framework for the responses and intervention strategies with the parents and children, any case management needs, and service recommendations. During the consultation, there is also a review of criminal records and local responses, prior child welfare history, the batterer's risk factors, the non-offending parent's protective strategies and strengths, possible challenges for the non-offending parent to participate in safety intervention, and there is also a review on the child's or children's level of exposure to violence, current functioning, and indicators or observations of the child's resiliency. Collaboration with local agencies and organizations. Our role as a domestic violence liaison is to bring awareness of domestic violence informed services and batterers intervention programs to the local office. There is ongoing collaboration with our Safe House, outreach services, children's programs, and legal programs. There is exploration of other DV service options available to best serve the families. Right now in our county, we have focus on supervision, which is a form of case conferencing within our local child welfare offices. Focus on supervision is a solution-focused and models collaboration and cross-system advocacy to strengthen community partnerships and best case practice. So 5 cases get selected a month, and if service providers are involved in the case, they are to attend the case conference to collaborate together on case practice, case management services, and recommendations moving forward. Our direct service is used as a coaching tool. So our direct service really is provided jointly with the caseworker at the home or in the local office or at the local domestic violence agency. We can provide direct service also in the family team meeting and in the meeting itself, court accompaniment to Superior Court for a restraining order hearing, or at municipality court for criminal charges. The goal of our direct service is also to provide a safe place for the non-offending parent to talk, for us to kind of define our roles as a domestic violence liaison, and to provide education to the non-offending parent and caseworker on available resources. Our case practice really implemented with the caseworker being present as a coaching tool for us to model best case practice and to provide the worker with the opportunity to develop skills and interviewing techniques with our guidance. The confidential direct service is really done in confidence. There are specific reasons as to why confidential direct services is recommended by the domestic violence liaison, and also the non-offending parent always has the option to have a confidential with the domestic violence liaison too. But really our goal is to kind of develop a relationship with the non-offending parent and caseworker throughout the life of the case. So we're going to kind of compare our caseload, because I am located in Ocean County and Devin is located in Burlington County. So even though we mirror the same case practice, as you can see, there is a little bit of a difference in caseload comparison. So Ocean, from January of 2016 and till June of 2016, Ocean has 233 new cases, ongoing cases 46, and direct service 144. And in Burlington, there is 157 new cases, ongoing 90, and direct service 56. So obviously there is a difference in our numbers, but what contributes to the difference? We happen to think that there are several factors. It really seems to depend on the local office's perception of the domestic violence liaison project. There was a high profile in Ocean County, which shifted the domestic violence case practice. It was a child death, so it really shifted it very much. leadership committed to the Domestic Violence Liaison project in Ocean County at that point. Even though efforts to build capacity in our consultations by modeling and coaching a big piece of the pie to help support domestic violence case practice and the Liaison project was to have that support by leadership. For instance, in Burlington over the year, there has been an increase in commitment from leadership to this program, which has directly increased the referrals and the expectation that the Domestic Violence Liaison's recommendations are to be followed. Both operates traditionally as a top-down culture, which in turn influences the entire office. So this slide kind of goes over our case practice. The next slide will be a little bit more about screening and assessing, but this slide we want to really highlight as a strong collaborative work between the domestic violence and child welfare agencies and places the emphasis on modeling, coaching, mentoring role of the domestic violence liaison. Ways the domestic violence liaison mentors child welfare workers. One, by jointly completing the case practice form, which is an assessment of their domestic violence assessment during consultations. During our consults, we provide the worker with questions that should be asked and how to ask those questions. We also present different possibilities as to why dynamics, behaviors, or choices might be there for workers to consider. It is really trying to look at the family with a shared perspective to include the non-offending parent's perspective, the caseworker's perspective, and the domestic violence liaison perspective. There's also discussions of protective factors that may be hard to identify and the informal ways the non-offending parent safety plans. There's discussion of the impact on children beyond the obvious indication. Discussion on how to use their Department and Child Protection Permanency's domestic violence protocol in their case practice, and to kind of help the caseworkers identify and address gaps and barriers that families face in obtaining needed support and safety. Really, we don't consider the non-offending parent our client. We consider, child welfare office our client. The goal of the domestic violence liaison is to really develop that capacity of the local office in understanding domestic violence and how to intervene in families with the co-occurrence of domestic violence and child maltreatment. And much of this work is done through informal education around domestic violence dynamics, system responses to victims, batterers, and children, and helping workers shift the way they think about domestic violence and child safety in order to develop creative interventions for families. So this slide goes over the screening and assessment. So to kind of go over screening, it really starts with the initial referral at the Central Registry, our child abuse and neglect hotline. And then it gets done at the initial interview and at all stages throughout the involvement with the family. So some challenges we face in screening are the questions that are, is there domestic violence, versus asking behavior-based questions that indicate risk, the disclosure process and how it differs from each survivor. It's important as advocates and for the caseworker to recognize the power imbalances when we are building trust and rapport with these families. And if the violence hasn't been documented or the assessment the caseworker does doesn't get documented either. So part of our assessment is also talking about case practice and maybe talking with the caseworker about implicit and explicit biases and what that looks like in their engagement with families. It's so crucial to take the time and challenge and examine our preconceived notions and assumptions about individuals and families. Another important piece of assessment is to gather information on the non-offending parent's interpretation of her culture, to assess what her experiences were like seeking help, and to listen and invalidate her experiences. Part of the assessment, we're looking at coercive behaviors. Teaching the worker how to use the power and control wheel while they're doing their assessment, what questions to ask, looking at the pattern of behaviors rather than just the physical violence, and really understanding the co-occurrence of domestic violence with mental health and substance abuse. We're also looking at risk and safety. So what are the identified risk factors here? Are there issues with substance abuse, mental health? How will working with child welfare impact the non-offending parent and children's safety? Are we making sure that safety planning is getting done on a regular basis and not looking at it as a standard intervention? Also following protocol in regards to the interview order, so interviewing mom first, the child, and then the batterer, and also looking at protocol within family team meetings, and also taking into consideration the safety for the child welfare workers. The next part is looking at the children's exposure. So how do we talk to children about domestic violence? What does their exposure look like? What is their level of functioning? In what ways is the exposure impacting them? In what ways has the non-offending parent balanced or limited that exposure? And are they capable of safety planning? And how will removal impact the children? And then last but not least, protective factors. So what does her safety planning look like? What are her identified strengths? What behaviors do we not understand? Is there a safety reason these choices are being made? So in what ways can we partner with her to increase the power of those protective factors?
Hi, this is Devin Rojas, the other domestic violence liaison in New Jersey, and I'm going to finish up with the second half of our presentation. One of the big efforts that has kind of fallen into the lap of domestic violence liaisons across the state is teaching the child welfare workers how to engage the parent using domestic violence. And this has come about for a few reasons. Some local offices have identified this as a goal that they want to work on by increasing their engagement of dads. And so this was an opportunity for domestic violence liaisons to be a part of that effort to ensure that increasing engagement of dads doesn't translate also to increasing unsafe engagement of dads using domestic violence. And then we also identified with our caseworkers an interest in learning how to do this more effectively. And so it's something that we've really started partnering on and using these 6 key principles kind of as our framework for working with them. So safety is always a top priority. And we want to work with caseworkers in understanding how involvement with child welfare increases or decreases the safety for the non-offending parent and their children, and what the implications of engaging the abusive partner is going to look like as far as the non-offending parent and children's safety. We do this really by the caseworkers how to collaborate with the non-offending parent when they're engaging the abusive partner, and making sure that we're safety planning throughout this entire process with the non-offending parent. Respect for the abusive partner is another major key principle, and we work with the caseworkers during our consults to identify what their personal feelings and reactions are to the abusive partner, and how we can help the caseworker work through those so that they can develop some genuine respect for that partner so that we can move forward in effective engagement with them. And that really kind of leads into the next key principle, which is developing a rapport with the abusive partner. We know that when the parents trust their caseworker and view their caseworker as a valuable asset to their family's well-being, they're going to be more likely to cooperate with services that are recommended and are able to start opening some honest communication and building a trusting relationship with this caseworker. This can be a big challenge for a lot of caseworkers because it's also a constant balancing act. This caseworker might realistically be the first person who is expecting the abusive partner to change his behaviors. And so it's really working with caseworkers on what does accountability look like for a domestic violence offender while still maintaining a safe, supportive relationship with that person also. And so talking about accountability, which is a key principle, it can sometimes be a natural contradiction with child welfare because the way the system is set up, it allows for the abusive partner oftentimes to kind of fly under the radar and not have to participate in services since so much focus tends to fall back on the mother of the children. We use what's called the structured interview in our county to really kind of keep that focus on the perpetrator of domestic violence as the one who's accountable for shifting their behaviors to increase child safety. And this is a tool that really helps the workers start thinking strategically about engaging this person and strategic ways to hold this person accountable and shift their case practice to understanding how domestic violence can create risk for children. It also teaches them how to engage a person in a way where there is some kind of trusting accountability and what the implications are of not engaging this abuser. We go through kind of what-if scenarios of what if we don't engage this person? What if we don't have this interview? What if we don't make this recommendation? What's that going to look like for this family 6 months down the road, a year down the road? And the caseworkers kind of start developing this ability to really kind of think about all the different options and what that's going to mean for child safety. We also talk a lot about limit setting, helping the caseworkers see the ways in which somebody who uses domestic violence might attempt to align child welfare with him, might attempt to distract child welfare workers with the parenting decisions that the victim is making, and help them plan for effective and time-efficient interviews. This has been one of the areas that we get a lot of feedback from caseworkers on concern that they're going to lose control of the conversation or that it'll go on for hours and won't be highly productive. And so we really strategize ways with them to maintain control of that conversation and help to ensure that they're accomplishing the goals they set out when they meet with this person. We also help to promote positive visions of culture and fatherhood and a realistic idea of what that means. We get a lot of parents using domestic violence who express verbally an interest in being good parents but aren't actually demonstrating that. And so we talk about what are the behaviors of a good parent, what are the behaviors of a committed parent, and caseworkers to put that in very formal ways in their case plans with parents using domestic violence. We have a lot of workers who sometimes also very fairly wonder, maybe the family would actually be safer without him. And what would that look like for kids? And so we have, very candid conversations with workers about the pros and cons of that kind of scenario and what it means to not engage him. And most of the time the reality comes down to he's the father of the kids, he's going to have rights, and he's going to have to the kids. And so we have a responsibility to the children to develop a safe and loving, supportive relationship with their father and teach him how to do that with their mother also. And this really can help to motivate caseworkers to step out of their little space and try something that can be really kind of very intimidating for them right off of the bat. Part of the domestic violence project that we do in order to be successful really has to engage all levels of leadership, and it starts with where we sit in our offices or in our cubicles on a daily basis, putting together reports and stats that get pushed up to all levels of leadership across the state that identifies common trends. And what we see happen a lot of the time is the same case practice challenges that I might experience in Burlington are the same case practice challenges that CARE is going to experience in Ocean County. And that tends to be the trend across the region and the state. And so it kind of gives us a focus on what we as DVLs want to kind of target in on as our goals for the project. We also use a lot of clinical and task supervision in our local offices that help us to identify different ways within our specific office culture that we can help to shift that case practice and look at ways to motivate a local office to take these changes. Also what's called the regional DVL meetings. We're split into 3 regions, and each region meets quarterly to talk about the trends across our counties and to highlight successes that we might want to take back to our own counties and try out there. And then there's a representative that moves information up to the state level and allows for our voices to be heard at that level. We also have in each county a DV collaborative meeting. It's county specific, and it engages management, local domestic violence agencies from our batterers intervention programs and from the local child welfare offices, We highlight successes within the local office that we want to be able to replicate as far as case practice goes, and gives us the opportunity to share with our local offices what some of the challenges we have are and how they might be able to support us in that. And then we also have our DVL statewide meeting, which is similar to the regional meeting but takes place on a statewide level, and it also includes collaboration, the Division of Women, and the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence. So we have a lot of resources in our state that allows for the success of this program, and really strong partnership with these resources have been able to really kind of help us leverage finances and funding and time so that we can all work towards the same goal, which is the safety of children. In both of our counties, both Ocean and Berlin, have a PALS program, Peace for a Learned Solution, which is a very intensive therapy program for children who've been exposed to domestic violence. It's housed within the domestic violence program and is available for children ages 3 to 12 years old, but there's some counties that can take children up to the ages of 17. The disadvantage is that we unfortunately don't have any bilingual or culture-specific services for children exposed to domestic violence at this time. We also have our batterers intervention and responsible fatherhood programs. Not all counties are able to have this, but most counties are able to partner with one that does in order to bring those services in. In Ocean County, they're able to have on-site batterers intervention programs in their local child welfare office, which has shown to be really successful in increasing the participation for dads who are involved in child welfare. We also have an Ocean County transitional housing program that allows for our clients to stay for up to 2 years, but again, this is also not available in all counties. And we have some co-occurrence programs, but this is not, again, available to all counties. One that I refer to a lot has various levels of participation, including intensive outpatient, intensive inpatient, and provides transportation for clients who are not able to access their own transportation. And they programs for co-occurrence, both trauma and mental health or substance abuse. We have some legal services within Providence House. We're able to provide legal clinics that help to prep clients for what to expect in various legal issues, primarily regarding restraining orders and custody or divorce. And then we have some limited legal services through South Jersey Legal Services, where they're able to take on some actual cases and represent victims in court who are towards getting a final restraining order. And then as far as transportation, for Providence House with our PALS program for the kids, we're able to provide some transportation to help get them to services here at our location. And child welfare does a pretty great job here about setting clients up with bus passes. One of the obstacles we run into in my county particularly, because we are so geographically spread, is that the bus is not always a realistic option. We have some, because of their location, who will spend 4 hours a day on public transportation just to get to one counseling program. But we see a lot is caseworkers managing their visits and their caseload so that they can go out and pick those clients up, drop them off at that location, do another visit, take the client back up from their counseling services, and then return them back to their home where they then do another visit in that area. So some of the challenges that we run into as domestic violence liaisons are pretty common across the board when it comes to DVL programs in the state. One of the big ones is engaging the parent using violence. There's oftentimes a lack of understanding on how to effectively engage him. A lot of caseworkers express concern over a lack of quote-unquote authority on engaging the abuser, over-relying sometimes on court orders, and focusing on the parent that the child is residing with, who is often the non-offending parent. And so some of the things, referencing back to slide 6 and our engaging the partner using violence, falling back on those key principles, helping caseworkers develop their engagement skills and their confidence in working with the parent using domestic violence, and you call the structured interview in order to help them really start thinking strategically about this. The office culture can sometimes be a big challenge because it's conflict sometimes with the goals of what the Domestic Violence Liaison Project is. It's a very fast-paced environment where workers have 60 days to complete an investigation, and oftentimes they don't get the background checks from their investigation until they're coming up on closing, say day 58, and that's oftentimes where they're in the presence of domestic violence. And so now they're kind of in this place of, I know I have to make this referral, but now I'm going to be over my deadlines, and what does that mean? So some of the things that we've done to try to work with that is helping workers talk about domestic violence from their initial interview with every family, opening the door to that conversation so that they're already setting that tone, building that relationship with the non-offending parent, and opening the door for the possible presence of domestic violence to be much earlier than waiting for a background check to come in. We also model a trauma-informed approach to working with families so that workers will be able to start building really strong, trusting relationships very early in their experiences with families. We also run into some major problems with not having enough DVLs. There's some counties where there's one DVL for possibly 3 or 4 offices, and so they might not get more business day in a local office, and it can really slow down their ability to develop relationships with the office, their ability to keep up with the trends happening in their office, and they might miss a lot of important meetings or case transfers or deadlines that workers are coming up on. It also leads to a high turnover rate for DVLs because it is such a demanding position, and DVLs are often struggling to manage caseloads of past 40 new referrals a month. The high caseloads, both for the DVLs and the caseworkers, can be a really big challenge. If a DVL is managing 20 new referrals and still has 10 or 15 cases from the previous month that they're working, it's very unrealistic that they'll be able to provide direct service on all of those cases. And so the DVL has to be able to work really closely with their caseworkers on identifying which families are in need of direct service, which casework might be in need of a little bit more modeling and mentoring, and always managing, the risk of burnout and compassion fatigue, both for themselves, but oftentimes for the caseworkers also. DVLs oftentimes kind of become a person that caseworkers come to with their frustrations with their job and their local offices because we're not part of that environment. And so helping caseworkers to manage all of those feelings around that. Caseworkers also have limited time to develop workers on case practice. If you only spend 1 day a week in a local office and you're attempting to model what a structured interview with a perpetrator of domestic violence looks like, you might have 1 hour on your initial consult, 30 to 60 minutes in an interview prep, an hour in the interview, another 30 to 60 minutes on a follow-up debrief with the caseworker, plus the time that the worker has to spend documenting that. And so that really can very easily total over a half day's work on one issue for just one family. And so right up front, the DVL is looking at asking workers to invest a lot of time in working on something that's very, very specific. And so DVLs have to spend a lot of time showing the value in this with caseworkers and showing that, initially up front it's going to be a lot of work, but here's how it's going to play out at the end. And then, okay, so I'm running low on time. Should I just kind of skip to this next slide, guys, or do y'all want me to get to the questions and answers?
Go ahead and finish.
Okay. So I'll move through this pretty quickly. These are some of the lessons learned in the direction that we see the domestic violence program going. Domestic violence liaisons have had to really kind of define what success means for ourselves. It's what we call the golden nuggets when we see a supervisor teaching their caseworkers how to talk about the power and control wheel on the very first interview. That's what a lot of domestic violence liaisons are going to call a major win, where we see that ripple effect of increased case practice and increased awareness of domestic violence. We also see an increased collaboration with community partners and caseworkers teaching their networks about domestic violence. We've had a lot of caseworkers who were talking with in-home family therapists about what domestic violence looks like and what are the indicators of domestic violence and how to safety plan with children. And they're taking exactly what we taught them and teaching it to their profession. Indicators of capacity building. We see an increase in referrals, which shows the value of the program, and an increase in the understanding of domestic violence dynamics. And really the biggest indicator of capacity building, in my opinion, is when I see caseworkers using a really sophisticated approach to working with families experiencing domestic violence and caseworkers who really want to safely and effectively engage the parent using domestic violence and are really partnering with non-offending parents so that they can bring safe interventions in for the entire family. And that is what Kara and I have for the domestic violence program here in New Jersey.
Great. Thanks so much, Devin and Kara, and you too, Joe. We do have a little bit more than 15 minutes left, and people are starting, well, obviously a lot of people want your tools, both of you, so the council will help facilitate that so everybody can get the tools that Joe has been mentioning and Kara and Devin. And now we're going to open it up for some questions, and while you're thinking out there about what your questions may be for Joe and Kara and Devin, I'll start with one. And this is a question that Susan Schechter used to ask me incessantly, for any of you who know her, which is what, and I'll put this to Kara and Devin first, but what are the women saying? What are victims saying about their experiences, getting help in the community, their experiences with child welfare, their experiences with domestic violence programs? Can you share a little bit of insight about what they're saying to you guys?
What I've noticed that they've been saying to us is just a lot of them haven't actually even been aware of domestic violence services within the community. So they're very happy to hear, like, I didn't even know that existed. It's like a relief for them. I've seen women cry because they didn't know that there was also support within the DCPMP office besides the caseworker, and also just having a domestic violence advocate located in the office to kind of just partner and just be there together in the best ways we can support that person. So I've gotten really positive feedback, even just going to court with them too, and the caseworkers at times have been actually able to accompany the non-offending parent also along with me to just be there to support. I think is the best thing, and I've gotten nothing but positive feedback about that.
And one of the things I've
Go ahead.
One of the things I've gotten some feedback about too really is in our confidential conversations with the non-offending parent when we're talking about what it's going to mean if they decide to disclose the presence of domestic violence to their caseworker, and seeing the nerves of behind what that goes into. A lot of times they're worried that the child welfare program is going to hold it against them in some kind of way. And so being able to support the non-offending parent through that process and letting them know that there's somebody in that office who's supporting the caseworker through this also really builds the confidence in the parents in being able to work with their caseworker and being able to really let their caseworker know these are the concerns that I have and this is how I want for you guys to be able to support me.
Great. We do have a couple of questions coming in. First one is to you guys, Kara and Devin. The question is there a special training that you get to become a DVL?
There's not specific training to become a DVL. Our positions here require so many years and experience working with domestic violence, but once you're hired, we do participate in all the same pre-service trainings that the child welfare workers participate in their first year of being hired.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question came in, which is a very popular question, which is the sort of overlap between family court and dependency court, and when women are potentially involved in both or involved in family court, and then there's a child abuse report, and child welfare doesn't want to take the report because they feel like they're not a party to it, and they're probably some of the most complicated family situations that many of us have worked with over the years. And I'm wondering, both for New Jersey and Ohio, particularly Joe at the state level, how these issues have been resolved or addressed in any way, and from Kara and Devin too, do you see this kind of overlap stuff, and how do you address it? Joe, do you want to take it first?
Sure, I can speak to Ohio's experience. It's definitely a common problem that probably other folks have experienced. We see families speaking with their child welfare office saying, no, it's really not that bad. I got this. I can protect the kids. We're going to be okay, in an attempt to keep their children in their custody. And at the same time, they have to sometimes actually go across the street to a different building and say, we really need help from the court. We really need help. He's dangerous. He can't have unsupervised access to these kids. And so we are spending a lot of times really helping our child welfare field and professionals understand the relationship between how their information may be used in custody cases or in domestic relations courts, family courts. While we're also helping them understand sort of the weight and implication of some of their decisions, and how they can close cases safely. We are also actually, when I was talking about some of the collaboration we do within our Ohio IPV Collaborative, we're actually also doing collaboration outside of that project as well, because that project is really focused on child welfare. So we've brought all of those partners, and then our CASA GAL Association and many others, our Attorney General's Office, and we're actually developing a 2017 large summit by invitation to kind of address some of these issues, because we are actually really, really concerned about the status of kids in Ohio that are being maltreated when domestic violence is present. It seems like we're doing a much better job protecting kids that are victims of maltreatment, abuse, neglect when DV is not present. But when that gets added in, somehow the train keeps going off the track. So we've definitely been eyeballing that and trying to come up with some more solutions.
Kara and Devin, do you have any experience of when the protective parent may be reporting injuries, but the child welfare system doesn't want to get involved?
I know in our central screening, it seems like they take a lot of the referrals, but what the actual caseworker does with it, I think it honestly really varies caseworker to caseworker and the unit too, depending what the supervisor says and the casework supervisor says, and really how domestic violence informed that caseworker supervisor or caseworker supervisor is. Because I've kind of seen where caseworkers do accept it, and they send the child for maybe a trauma evaluation, or they send court reports, outlining the potential risk that the parent may be to the child. But I've also seen it on the flip side where it's, oh, that's a family matter, that's not anything we could do, there's no marks or bruises. But, I mean, it definitely is a larger issue that we have to examine to kind of see, how we could find solutions to it.
Lana, I'd like to add one other thing, looking at the question more closely, too, about protective parents reporting injuries. We used to always, when we were working with our domestic violence advocates, train them when they had to make a report or at a mandatory report they were making, to ask the parent maybe that they're working with to make that call. We thought that was kinder and gentler and empowering. We are finding that sometimes that we need to be more critical in our thinking around that and work with the parent to decide what the best approach is with that agency. If they've had 5 calls from mom and aren't responding, asking her to make that call again. Sometimes they're getting really frustrated both the agency and the protective parent. And so sometimes having a licensed social worker, a trained advocate, make that call and explain it in a different way may actually get some action. So we're really rethinking our advice to our advocates and asking them to think more critically about how we can support someone making those types of reports, because they do sometimes get discounted or appear to be, a parent frustrated by a custody suit or, alienating the other parent and those kinds of conversations.
Right. Great. Thank you. Another question came in, which is a good one, and I'm curious if anybody knows about anything, but specific training curriculums for child welfare supervisors on how to engage workers in supervision. I will say there is a very old curriculum that we did in Massachusetts, but I have no idea what its shelf life has been or if there's new curriculums out there that help supervisors. I think we all can probably agree that the training and building the capacity of the leaders within child welfare has a longer life because of turnover and other things, and can really get embedded. So I'm wondering, does anybody know about curriculums for supervisors and managers?
In Ohio, the Safe and Together training that is provided to workers actually has 2 days for supervisors. We're also, as we deliver those trainings in Ohio through we've got a core of trainers that does that. They are encouraging much more registration from even the administrative and executive level. We've got communities that are really doing that first. They're training management and executives, then they're training their workers and have specialized days for the supervisors as well. But that's where protocol and policy come in, because some people will do the practice and it will tend to develop the protocol down the line, and in some cases we need to have that protocol in place so that the expectations around that training and that participation are clear and accountable to it. So they really go hand in hand.
So I want to dive in a little bit to the questions around engaging offenders. And Kara and Devin, you did a good job. I think it was Devin. You did a really good job of sort of laying out those principles, and they're helpful principles to have. But it always doesn't. It's a challenge because we either have people really afraid of this work, of engaging men or parents who use violence, and people who are super hopeful about it and, maybe colluding, et cetera, and to strike that right balance, right, between hope, a little bit of hope, a little bit of fear, to keep us on a path. And so I'm curious about, what has been, your biggest lesson there, but also like in the details of this, it's tricky to be able to have conversations with victims and let victims know what you're going to do, and let victims know you need to have a conversation with her partner, but not wanting to do any more harm, and have that sort of back and forth communication. But what do you do when a victim says, no, absolutely not, please don't talk to my partner, that'll make things much worse for me? Because child welfare, as we know, has policies around, particularly if it's a father, to engage that father during an investigation or otherwise. So how do you handle that? Do you have like waiver policies? How do you handle that tricky balance?
We don't have any waiver policies when referrals come in for domestic violence because the abuser is listed as the perpetrator. So by their policy, they have no choice but to kind of interview the perpetrator because he is the listed one. So it does make it a little bit more challenging when trying to engage him and make it as safe as could be for mom. So I think just kind of listening to her and really just engaging and building rapport and really strategizing to the best way we could possibly to not put her at risk, we never disclosed to him what she says, and we're trying to look at other collateral information that would maybe be something we can kind of incorporate in the interview.
Uh-huh.
I think, though, that one of the problems we run into with that is that if the victim is insisting that no, she doesn't want him interviewed or engaged in any kind of way, and the worker has to, that right there is going to really kind of undo a lot of the work that worker has already done in building that relationship. And so looking at ways how we can support the worker in that process also is really crucial to that, and helping the worker to always keep that door open for the non-offending parent in the event that they're able to start repairing that relationship. And then for the first half of your question, as far as the balancing, if workers are really very nervous and don't want to be a part of this process, or if they're really on board with it, but then kind of at risk of being aligned with the offender and how we kind of manage that. We do a lot of work during that initial consult and in the interview prep. And so I have a form that I go through with the worker to plan every step of the interview. And we really look at, in one of the areas, what could go wrong during this interview. And I kind of guide the workers to self-identifying what could go wrong, and talking about what is it going to look like when he's attempting to align you and collude with you. What's it going to look like when he's deflecting his responsibility and pushing it back on the victim's parenting choices? And what are our strategies to managing that? And then I follow every interview with the perpetrator up with a debrief with the caseworker to see where their head is at, what their feelings and their responses and thoughts were around the interview, and seeing kind of what direction they're thinking about going. And if this is a safe direction, then how are we going to do that? And if it's not a safe direction, then what do I need to do to help the worker see what their other options are?
Great. It's a lot.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of balancing and tricky work, and I want to thank all three of you for all the work that you've been doing on behalf of families involved in the child welfare system, victims and their kids, and thank the council. And I guess we're going to turn it back over to Amanda.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to all the presenters, Lana, Joe, Kara, and Devin. Really appreciate you taking the time this morning or afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. And thank you everyone for attending. Really good turnout. We're very excited. Just reminder that at the conclusion of the session, you'll have a pop-up with the survey. Please go ahead and complete that. That helps us improve our programming. And then once that's done, you'll be able to request a certificate of attendance if you need one. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.